The engineers said it would never fly. They studied the drawings, they ran the numbers, and they sent back a single word. Impossible. 3 days! That was all it took to prove them wrong. 3 days in March of 1943 over a stretch of ocean called the Bismarck Sea, when a dozen of those impossible airplanes helped send 12 enemy ships to the bottom. But the story starts months earlier, in a hangar at Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane, Australia, where a grey-haired mechanic named Paul Gunn crouched beneath the nose of a bomber and did something the experts swore could not be done. He was bolting machine guns into the glass nose of an attack plane, into the very space where a bombardier was supposed to sit. Steel frame, heavy barrels, belts of half-inch ammunition coiled on the concrete like sleeping snakes. The men who watched him work had opinions. They said the weight would drag the nose down. They said the plane would want to fall out of the sky the moment it left the runway. They said it would never fly right. Some of them said it plainly. It was impossible. The man kept working. Paul Gunn was 43 years old. He was not a general. He was not a factory engineer with a slide rule and a room full of wind tunnel data. He was a mechanic who had taught himself to fly a man who read machines the way other men read faces. And in the summer of 1942, in a war, the Allies were losing across the entire Pacific. He had become convinced of one dangerous idea. If you wanted to kill a ship, you had to fly low enough to touch it. To understand why that idea mattered, you have to understand what the war looked like from Australia that year. The Japanese had swept south with terrifying speed. The Philippines had fallen. Singapore had fallen. And in the jungles of New Guinea, just north across the water, the enemy was digging in building bases, reaching toward Australia itself. The problem was supply. The Japanese fed those bases by sea convoy after convoy, sliding down from the great fortress harbor at Rabaul. And the Allied air forces could not stop them. Heavy bombers droned over the convoys from 15,000 feet and dropped their loads onto empty ocean. From that height, a moving ship was a needle threading itself through the waves. The bombs fell, the water swallowed them. The ships sailed on. When the bombers came down lower, to aim better, the ships killed them. Anti-aircraft gunners lined the decks, and a bomber flying slow and level was the easiest target in the world. Crews went out and did not come back. The math was brutal and it was not improving. Into that deadlock walked Paul Gunn. He had not come to the war as a soldier. He had come to it as a businessman with grease under his fingernails. Years in the United States Navy had made him an aviator. One of the enlisted pilots the Navy trained in those days, a man who flew without ever being handed an officer's commission. He served more than 2 decades and retired at the end of 1939. Then he did what restless men do. He went looking for a frontier. He found it in the Philippines, helping to start a small airline with a handful of twin-engine Beechcraft planes. He flew cargo. He flew passengers. He knew every island, every strip of packed dirt that a plane could land on. And he had his family with him. His wife Clara, the woman everyone called Polly. Their 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. A life built far from Arkansas, where he had been born the son of a blacksmith. Then December of 1941 came and the war reached out and took all of it. And when the Japanese struck the Philippines, Gunn flew. He flew supplies to trapped men. He flew key personnel out of danger. And at the end, as the islands were collapsing, he was ordered to carry a load of staff officers south to Australia. He climbed into the cockpit and he left. He left his wife behind. He left his 4 children behind. And this is the part of the story the numbers can never hold. The enemy that Paul Gunn spent the rest of the war designing weapons to destroy was the same enemy that now held his family behind barbed wire. In January of 1942, Polly and the 4 children were rounded up with thousands of other civilians and interned at Santo Tomas, a university in Manila, turned into a prison camp. They had been there since the 20th of that month. Gunn did not know if they were alive. He did not know if they were being fed. He only knew where they were and that there was nothing he could do to reach them. So he did the only thing a man like Paul Gunn could do. He went to work. The Allied air forces in Australia were, in the words of the new commander who arrived that summer, a mess. Wrecked planes, missing parts, exhausted crews and empty supply lines, and scattered across the airfields near Brisbane sat the carcasses of aircraft that had been shot up, cracked up, or simply worn out. Some accounts put the number near 170 wrecks. Fighters that would never fly again, stripped, cracked, and left to rot in the sun. Most men saw a junkyard. Paul Gunn saw a parts bin. He went through those wrecks one by one, and with a small team of mechanics, he began to raise the dead. An engine from this one, a wing from that one, instruments, cables, hydraulics, wheels. By the accounts of the men who were there, he brought more than 100 grounded aircraft back to flying condition aircraft the Allies desperately needed and thought they had lost. He did it without factories. He did it without paperwork. He did it when he had to by ignoring the officers who told him he couldn't. There are stories about Paul Gunn from those days, and not all of them are flattering. He was rough. He was profane. He was famous for telling tall tales that grew taller with each retelling, and famous too for a temper that did not bend to rank. There is a story passed down and hard to prove that he once pulled a pistol on a supply officer who wouldn't give him the parts he wanted. Whether it happened exactly that way or not, the fact that men believed it tells you something about the man. He was not a hero from a recruiting poster. He was a stubborn, difficult, self-taught mechanic who had decided the rules were slowing down the war. And from those same wrecks he took something else. Guns. The fighters that would never fly again still carried their weapons. 50 caliber Browning machine guns, heavy enough to punch through the skin of a ship. Guns that had belonged to pilots who in many cases were never coming back for them. Gunn pulled those guns from the wrecks. He cleaned them. He mounted them onto a steel frame, and he carried them to the nose of a Douglas A-20 Havoc, an attack bomber, and he built his impossible idea with his own hands. 450 caliber guns, firing straight ahead, a wall of lead pointed at whatever the pilot pointed the plane at. The theory was simple and it was savage. If a bomber could hose down a ship's deck with that kind of firepower, on the way in the anti-aircraft crews would be dead or diving for cover before they could aim. And the bomber that could survive the approach could come in low enough finally to do what high-altitude bombing never could. Hit the ship where it lived, at the waterline, point blank. It was in every sense turning a bomber into something it was never designed to be. The new air commander in the Southwest Pacific was a sharp, aggressive general who had arrived that summer to take over the wreckage and make it fight. When he came through the airfields and found this grey-haired captain quietly converting his aircraft into gunships using weapons scavenged from the dead, he did not order him to stop. He was impressed. He pulled Paul Gunn off the ordinary chain of command and made him something almost unheard of. A special projects officer. A man whose job was to invent. Not to lead a squadron into battle, not to fly the missions himself, but to build the tools that other men would carry into the fire. It was a promotion and it was a cage, because it meant that whatever Gunn created he would have to hand to someone else and watch from the ground. That distinction would matter more than anyone knew. For now though, none of the doubters had been proven wrong or right. The guns were bolted on. The frame was welded tight. But the plane had not yet flown with its new teeth, and the men in the hangar were still muttering the same word. Impossible. There was only one way to find out. Somebody was going to have to take that overloaded nose-heavy machine off the ground and pray it climbed. And across the water, unaware and unbothered, the Japanese convoys kept coming. The test flight almost ended everything before it began. When they finally rolled the modified A-20 onto the runway and pushed the throttles forward, the plane fought back. All that weight in the nose, 4 heavy guns, and their ammunition bolted, where nothing that heavy was ever meant to go, dragged the aircraft toward the earth. It wanted to nose over. It wanted to bury itself in the dirt at the end of the strip. The pilot hauled back on the controls and wheeled the thing into the air, and it climbed barely angry the whole way. But it climbed, and it flew. That was the answer to the doubters. Not a report, not a calculation. A plane in the sky that the engineers had said would never leave the ground. Gunn went back to work, rebalancing its shifting equipment toward the tail trimming and adjusting, until the machine that wanted to kill its pilot became a machine a man could actually fight in. And by the end of the summer of 1942, the concept stopped being a theory in a hangar and became a weapon in a war. On the last day of August, the strafers went out for the first time in a coordinated strike, joining medium bombers in an attack on the Japanese base at Lae on the New Guinea coast. The modified A-20s came in low, guns hammering, tearing across the airfield and the anti-aircraft positions before the defenders could react. It worked. The idea Paul Gunn had built out of scrap metal and dead men's guns worked exactly the way he said it would. The general who had made him a special projects officer wanted more. He wanted squadrons of these things. He wanted the enemy's ships turned into coffins. And that was where Gunn ran into the wall, that no amount of stubbornness could knock down. Physics. The A-20 was a beautiful strafer, but it was small. Its range was short. It could hit Lae, but the Japanese had bases scattered across a vast theater, some of them on the far side of the Owen Stanley Mountains, a wall of jungle-choked peaks that clawed up into the clouds. To reach the enemy where he really lived, and to hit the convoys far out at sea, you needed a plane that could carry more fuel, more bombs, and more guns, and still make the long flight home. The success of the A-20 had solved one problem and handed Gunn a bigger one. He needed a bigger airplane. He found it in the B-25 Mitchell, a medium bomber. Longer legs, heavier bones, more room in the nose. On paper, it was the answer. In practice, it was the whole fight all over again, only worse. Gunn did not do this alone. Working beside him now was a civilian, a field technical representative from North American Aviation, the very company that built the B-25. His name was Jack Fox, and he was the man the factory sent to the Pacific to look after its aircraft. Instead, he found himself helping a self-taught mechanic tear one of those aircraft apart and rebuild it into something the factory had never imagined. Two men, one from the assembly line and one from the junkyard, bent over the same impossible machine. They stripped the bombardier and his glass office out of the nose. They packed the space with 50 caliber guns. They bolted more guns onto the sides of the fuselage in blister packs. And when they were done, the front of that airplane was a solid fist of firepower, more guns aimed forward than any bomber was ever meant to carry. Then they tried to fly it. The B-25 was heavier than the A-20, and all that new weight sat forward, and the aircraft behaved exactly the way the engineers had warned. On takeoff, it wanted to drop its nose and dive back into the runway. A pilot had to hold the controls hard, backfighting the machine, coaxing it into the air by main strength. Get it wrong, and you were dead before you cleared the field. But once it was up, once it leveled off and steadied, it was something the world had never seen. A medium bomber that could rake a target with the concentrated fire of a whole flight of fighters, and then put bombs into it at point-blank range. A flying gun platform, a ship killer. The men on the ground had a name for it. They called it Pappy's Folly. That nickname Pappy had followed Gunn through the theater. The young pilots and crewsmen, 20 years his junior, looked at the grey-haired mechanic who outworked and outflew all of them, and gave him the name a son gives a father. Some said it started after he was shot down and spent days surviving in the jungle and his hair went white. Some said it was just because he was older than everyone around him. Whatever the reason, it stuck. Pappy Gunn. And Pappy's Folly was about to be judged by men who had never seen it fly, because as the strafers were being built in Australia, word of these strange modifications traveled back up the chain of command, all the way to the engineering authorities in the United States. And the verdict that came back was cold. According to the general who championed the project, the experts studied the drawings and declared the whole thing unsound. The balance was wrong. The airframe was overloaded. The modifications violated what the engineers knew about how these aircraft were supposed to behave. In their professional judgment, the machine would not fly properly, and the recommendation was to stop. Sit with that for a moment. At the exact moment the war in the Pacific hung in the balance, the very weapon that might turn, it was being condemned on paper by men thousands of miles from the fight. Men who had never watched a strafer come screaming across an airfield with its guns alight. The general refused to ground them. He had seen the A-20s work with his own eyes. He trusted the mechanic over the memo, and he ordered the conversions to continue. By the beginning of February 1943, roughly a dozen B-25 strafers were ready enough to arm a full squadron, and the general chose the men who would fly them into their first real test. The mission went to the 90th Bomb Squadron of the 3rd Bomb Group, and command of that squadron went to a young hard-charging major named Ed Larner. Larner was everything. Gunn was not in years, and everything he was in nerve. Barrel-chested, quick to raise his fists, a service cap shoved back on his head. He was known across the group as one of its most aggressive pilots, and by some of his peers as flat-out reckless. He believed in the strafer. He believed the medium bomber could be flown down to the wave tops and used like a torpedo plane, and he took his crews out over the harbor at Port Moresby to prove it. There, half sunk in the shallows, lay the rusting hulk of a merchant ship that had run aground before the war. It became their target. Again and again, Larner's B-25s roared in low and flat and skipped their practice bombs across the water, watching them bounce off the surface and slam into the wreck's iron side the way a flat stone skips across a pond. Skip bombing, they called it. It was the whole game. Come in low, hose the deck with the guns, so the enemy can't shoot back and skip a bomb into the hull at the waterline. They practiced on a wreck that could not shoot back. The men flying the A-20s that would come in behind them did not even get that. Accounts of the battle note that those crews flew no practice missions at all before the real thing. And the real thing was coming faster than any of them knew. Far to the rear, in windowless rooms in Melbourne and Washington, Allied codebreakers were reading the enemy's mail. They had cracked the Japanese naval codes, and in the middle of February, the intercepts began to paint a picture. The Japanese were assembling something at Rabaul, something big. The reconnaissance photos confirmed it. Ships gathering in the harbor, transports, escorts. By the last days of the month, the picture was complete, and it was alarming. A major convoy was preparing to sail. 8 transport ships loaded with roughly 6,900 soldiers, screened by 8 destroyers bound for Lae to reinforce the New Guinea front. The Japanese knew their crossing was dangerous. They gambled that the weather would protect them, that the low clouds and rain of the season would blind the Allied bombers long enough to slip through. The convoy left Rabaul in the dark near the end of February and turned into the Bismarck Sea. And on the Allied side, a plan came together. The general and the senior Australian air commander built it in layers, a coordinated strike stacked from high altitude down to the wave tops. Heavy bombers would hit first from up high to scatter the ships and draw their fire upward. Fighters would sweep the sky clear of enemy planes. And then into the chaos, the strafers would come in at mast height, guns, and skip bombs at the range where they could not miss. It was a beautiful plan. It was also built almost entirely on a weapon that had never been tried in a real battle, flown by men who had rehearsed on a shipwreck and condemned as impossible by the experts back home. Then on the 2nd of March, the first blow fell, and it seemed to prove the skeptics right. The heavy bombers found the convoy through breaks in the cloud and attacked from high altitude, exactly the kind of bombing that had failed against moving ships for the entire war. They dropped their loads. They claimed hits. And when the smoke cleared, the results were almost exactly what the doubters would have predicted. Out of that whole day of high-altitude bombing, the attackers managed to sink a single transport, the Kyokusei Maru, and damage 2 others. 1 ship. The rest of the convoy steamed on through the night, unbroken, heading for Lae, carrying thousands of men who would soon be thrown into the fight for New Guinea. High-altitude bombing had done what high-altitude bombing always did. Almost nothing. Everything now came down to the next morning. To a dozen overloaded gunships the engineers had called impossible. To a reckless young major and his crews. To a wall of scavenged 50 caliber guns aimed at 8,000 men on the water. And on the ground far from the sea stood the grey-haired mechanic who had built the weapon and would not be flying it. Pappy Gunn had done his part. What happened next was out of his hands. The morning of the 3rd of March came up grey over the Bismarck Sea. Somewhere on the ground at the headquarters, far from the water, Pappy Gunn waited. He was not in a cockpit. He was a special projects officer, a staffman, the inventor, and not the pilot. And on this morning of all mornings, that was the hardest thing in the world to be. The weapon he had built from wreckage and dead men's guns was about to be thrown against 8,000 of the enemy. He could not fly it. He could only wait to hear whether it worked or whether it had killed the young men carrying it. Out over the sea, the strike came together in layers, just as the plan had promised. High above, the heavy bombers rolled in first and opened fire, forcing the ships to twist and scatter and throw their anti-aircraft fire upward into the sky. Fighters slashed through the enemy planes trying to defend the convoy. And down low, skimming the wave tops, came the strafers. A dozen B-25 gunships, the impossible airplanes led by the reckless young Major Ed Larner. They came in at mast height, 50 feet above the water, close enough to see faces on the decks. Larner picked out a target and bore in, and 3 of his lieutenants tucked in behind him, unwilling to leave their leader alone in that fire. He did not want company. By the accounts of the men who were there, he shouted at them to break off and find their own ships. And then he did the thing no one had ever done in a real battle. He flew straight down the throat of the enemy at water-level guns alight. A young captain named Jock Hennebree watched it happen from the second element and later admitted what every man out there was feeling. They were afraid. Flying up to the side of a warship at 50 feet into the muzzles of its guns went against every instinct a pilot had. But when they saw Larner make that run, when they saw the guns work and the bombs strike home, the fear broke. If he could do it, they could do it. And then all 12 of them did it at once. The 50 caliber guns did exactly what Gunn had promised in that hangar in Brisbane. They walked across the decks in sheets of fire and cut down the anti-aircraft crews before they could aim. Gun positions that should have been throwing up a wall of steel went silent, their crews dead or diving for cover. And into that stunned, bleeding silence came the bombs skipping across the water, the way the men had practiced against a rusting wreck slamming into hulls at the waterline where a ship cannot survive being hit. One pilot, Robert Chatt, sent a skip bomb into a destroyer and left it out of control, and the crippled warship veered wildly and collided with a supply ship in the convoy. Both went to the bottom together. Ship after ship took the same medicine. The strafers came, and the A-20s came behind them, and the sea filled with burning steel. What high-altitude bombing had failed to do in an entire day, the gunships did in minutes. By the time it was over, the convoy that had left Rabaul with such careful planning simply did not exist anymore. All 8 transports were sunk. 4 of the 8 destroyers went down with them. 12 ships, 3 days exactly as the story has always been told. Of the roughly 6,900 soldiers who had sailed for Lae, only about 1,200 reached it. Somewhere near 2,900 men were killed, though some accounts place the number higher. The reinforcements that were supposed to turn the tide in New Guinea died in the water instead. The Allied cost by comparison was almost unbelievably small. 4 aircraft lost in the fighting, a single heavy bomber and 3 fighters, along with 2 more lost to accidents and 13 airmen dead. A convoy destroyed. A campaign turned, and Paul Gunn's impossible airplanes had done it. The men who called it folly on paper had their answer written across 40 miles of ocean. But the story does not end clean, and it would be a lie to pretend it does. On the 4th of March, as the battle wound down, the killing did not. Thousands of Japanese survivors were in the water, now clinging to rafts and lifeboats and floating wreckage, many of them soldiers who would be pulled from the sea and thrown right back into the fight for New Guinea if they reached the shore. And so Allied aircraft and patrol boats went back out over the water and strafed the survivors, the rafts, the lifeboats. It was defended at the time as grim necessity, a way to keep armed men from reaching the front and killing again. It has been argued over ever since. The men who flew those missions carried it differently. One airman whose son later spoke of it called it nothing to be proud of. But it was war. Both of those things were true at once, and an honest telling has to hold them both. That is the shape of the victory in the Bismarck Sea. Total, decisive, and stained. What came after followed its own hard logic. The verdict of the battle was so complete that the news traveled fast, and the engineering authorities who had condemned the strafers found themselves overtaken by events. The modifications a mechanic had built in a hangar were fed back into the factory, and later models of the B-25 rolled off the assembly line, bristling with forward-firing guns, some carrying a cannon in the nose. The impossible design became standard. The generals meanwhile reached for the story. The supreme commander in the theater issued a communiqué claiming a far larger victory than had actually occurred, more than 20 ships and nearly 13,000 men. The real numbers, 8 transports and 4 destroyers, were smaller. They were also more than enough. The Japanese never again tried to run a major convoy of troop ships to Lae. The lesson had been carved into them. And the man who made it possible, the war gave Paul Gunn very little of what a man in his place might have wanted. The victory did not free his family. Folly and the 4 children stayed behind the wire at Santo Tomas month after month as the war ground westward toward them. They were not liberated until February of 1945, nearly 2 years after the Bismarck Sea, and by then they were starving, worn down to almost nothing but alive. He had built a weapon that helped destroy the enemy's fleets, and it had not been able to reach the people he loved most until the very end. The young major, who had led the gunships in and broken his men's fear, Ed Larner, did not live to see any of it. Less than 2 months after the battle on the 30th of April, 1943, the same fearless flying that made him a leader, killed him when a low hard maneuver over an airfield ended in a crash. There were no survivors, and Gunn himself was never given the highest honors that men who knew his work believed he had earned. There were those who felt his contribution was merely technical, a matter of wrenches and gun mounts, not the stuff of medals. They were wrong, and the men who flew his aircraft knew they were wrong. But the recognition he was recommended for did not come through. He survived the war. He went back to the Philippines and rebuilt his airline once more, the way he had rebuilt broken airplanes out of a junkyard piece by stubborn peace. And in October of 1957, flying in the country he had adopted as his own, Paul Gunn was caught in a storm and his plane went down and he was gone. He was 57 years old. There is no clean monument to a man like that. No single tidy line that holds everything he was. He was a difficult, profane, self-taught mechanic who outworked younger men, who bent rules until they broke, who built a war-winning weapon with his own hands out of the wreckage of dead men's planes. He did it while the enemy he was fighting held his wife and his children in a prison camp he could not reach. And when the weapon he built won one of the most complete air victories of the entire Pacific War, he was standing on the ground waiting because that was where they had put him. The gunships he dreamed up in a hangar in Brisbane changed how air forces thought about the bomber. The idea of an aircraft that came in low guns blazing to kill what it could see with its own eyes outlived him by generations. But on that grey morning over the Bismarck Sea, none of that was written yet. There was only a dozen overloaded airplanes, a handful of frightened young men, a wall of scavenged guns, and one old mechanic on the ground who had been told it was impossible and who had built it anyway.